Okay, let's start then. So good afternoon to everyone and warm welcome to all the panelists and the participants to this roundtable event titled Beyond Resilience with a question mark, Resetting International Cultural Relations. So thank you all for joining and making the time for this exchange and sharing that will last for 1 hour and a half. I should say also good morning, not only good afternoon, good morning also to at least 2 of the panelists from the US and Brazil, and also from the same countries. The roundtable aims at presenting key findings of a study that has been commissioned by the Cultural Relations Platform and carried out and implemented with lead researchers from the University of Siena, and also with the support of 7 regional experts, because the scope of the study is much more large. And the study has looked at the impact of COVID-19 on culture and creative sectors and its implication on international cultural relations. The platform has published the study in February this year, more or less 4 months ago. And we are here today with the panelists and also with you all as participants to take stock on where we are today, what has changed since then, and how cultural operators, cultural actors in general, and artists will be moving forward in this context. We will also look at the role of international cultural relations also in this context. So before moving on with the introduction, some technical observations. The webinar will be recorded for some reporting purposes, and we will allocate around 25 minutes for questions and answers. So please, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and the team of the Cultural Relations Platform is kindly ensuring to collect all the questions to be addressed. So as many of you know, the Cultural Relations Platform is funded by the EU, as the EU has been according since a couple of years a lot of attention to international cultural relations, and has already set up a policy framework in this area. And we are very happy today to kick off this roundtable with Pilar Campos, who is a project manager at the Foreign Policy Instrument Division of the European Commission. So Pilar will make some introductory remarks before we turn to the panelists. Pilar, you have 2 minutes. I'm very sorry, I do apologize already, because I'll be very sharp on time, because we will need those 25 to 30 minutes for the questions and answers sessions.
Of course.
Please, Pilar.
Thanks a lot, Sana. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. A warm welcome from my side as well to this roundtable. For me, it is a pleasure to be here with you and to have this little time to address a few words. So in the last few years, the European Union action in the field of international cultural relations has really gained a political momentum, and especially since we adopted a strategic approach to international cultural relations and a framework for action. And only 5 years ago, it was recognized for the very first time the role that culture can play in the European Union external action in an official manner. And then only 1 year ago, the COVID-19 pandemic just surprised all of us, hitting heavily the cultural and creative sectors not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world. And the very essence and the nature of the cultural relations has been and continue to be extremely challenging under the current circumstances. So, however, I think, and I also believe there is a positive and a clear message that the pandemic has given to us, which is that the cultural and creative sectors are important in their own right. And this is to ensure the continued development of societies. So I think the European Union will continue working to support the key role that the culture can play and will play in the recovery of Europe and partner countries. So today's discussion, I think it's really very timely. As Sana was referring, we will be discussing the research study that we have conducted in the framework of the Cultural Relations Platform. And I think it's a unique opportunity to be together and to discuss how international cultural relations will or should transform in the new post-COVID-19 reality. And also how to foster creative and innovative resilience. So I'm very glad to be here with you today and to have this little time together. And I'm sure that it will really inspire all of us on our work on the coming months and years ahead. So thank you very much for joining us and for your participation here today. Sana, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Pilar. Thanks a lot. And thank you also for sharing some positive notes from your side also. It's very much appreciated. So let me turn to the panelists and let's dig into the heart of the discussion of today. So we have today with us Professor Pierangelo Isernia from the University of Siena, who co-authored the research we are talking about today. And I guess you can see it, you will see it in the chat. You will see the link to our website and to the study in the chat. We have also Lauren Agosta. She's Senior Culture and Collaborations Lead at Open Society Foundation, New York. Hi, Lauren. And Mohit Dhingra, he's expert at capacity building for European capitals of culture from New Delhi, from India. And Beth Ponte, she's arts manager, consultant, and a researcher from Salvador, Brazil. You will also see in a couple of minutes the bios of all the speakers in the chat, in case you would like to know more about their background. But let me tell you that Lauren, Beth, and Mohit are the three of them are alumni from of a global cultural leadership program that has been implemented in the past since 2016 till 2019, and the cultural diplomacy platform to which this current platform is actually succeeding. So probably before the end of our webinar, I'll be sharing some information about the new version of the program, which is called now the Global Cultural Relations Program. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Pierangelo. Pierangelo, you will have 5 minutes to give us some background of the research and some key findings, including also key findings related to Brazil, the US, and India in this case. Thank you. The floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Pilar, for your words. And hi, everybody. I see some familiar face among the audience. Of course, in 5 minutes, you cannot expect me to synthesize a report that is more than 100 pages long and has at least 3 times the number of pages of appendixes. So what I would try to do is to offer to you a few snapshots of what we did. And as usual from academics, I will start with a few caveats about how you should take our work. And the first is about the timing of our work, because our work was a picture, was a snapshot of the very first period of the pandemic world as we know it, because we basically analyze the impact and the consequences of COVID-19 on the cultural and creative sector in the period between the outbreak of the pandemic and the late part of the year 2020. So this means that we tried to capture what was happening in the first stages of the process. Of course, things has been changing since then. In which direction are we going is not clear at all, but I think this would be food for discussion later on. A second caveat is that we basically cover a lot of countries and areas of the world that are very different in terms of the nature of the cultural and creative sector, in terms of socio-economic characteristics, as well as political characteristics. So it's very difficult to try to synthesize what we found, but I'll try to do it anyway. And of course, will be the task of my successors to comment on whether I succeeded or failed. I will not indulge too much in discussing the impact of COVID-19. There is now, I would say, a cottage industry of report and studies that have been discussing and detailing all the different consequences of this pandemic on the cultural sector in terms of organizational, financial, political implications, as well as the asymmetric nature of the impact across the different cultural subsectors. What I would like to focus on in my next 3.5 minutes is to try to synthesize for you some of the main characteristics that might explain the different responses that countries gave to this pandemic and its impact on cultural relations. That is based, of course, on the entire sample of cases we analyzed, but I will focus with the particular detail on India, Brazil, and the United States, as was my task. I would like to stress three main characteristics of these policy responses. Let me anticipate that all countries all over the world, as far as we know, have tried to address the consequences of the COVID-19 for the cultural sector. No countries has done nothing. Everybody tried to do something, and the number of policy responses has been varying in terms of both scope, intensity, quality, and so forth and so on. But there are variations, and these variations can be explained based, according to us, on three main factors. The first is the nature and the amount of financial resources available to the countries to deploy to help the cultural sector. And here we have a first big differences across countries. Let me give you a couple of examples. On the one hand, we have countries like South Korea in Asia, or some European countries in Europe that deployed a substantial amount of resources to address the problems of the cultural sector. Although I have to say, and we stress in the report, that it's very difficult to find a common way of addressing all the different sectors of the cultural world. On the other hand, we have countries like India, in which the amount of resources that were deployed to address the concerns and the problems of the cultural sector has been much less in amount and intensity. So a first problem is to what extent the countries were able to deploy resources for the cultural sector. The second important factor that explains the differences across these countries is the relationship between the public authorities of these countries and the cultural sector itself. And here a good example is the comparison between the United States of America on the one hand and countries like China or Italy and France on the other. Why? Because if you can imagine a continuum of different socioeconomic structure that address the cultural sector, on the one hand, we have countries in which the cultural sector is very much decentralized and left to the private market. And on the other hand, we have countries in which the cultural sector relies heavily upon the public sector. Now, from this viewpoint, being on one side or the other of this continuum makes a lot of a difference in at least three terms. First, non-state actors have played a much greater role in addressing the problems of the cultural sector in countries in which the public authorities were more reluctant to get into this field. The United States, again, is a good example where we find that on the one hand, NGOs, private foundations, and private institutions have deployed much of the resources that were needed to the sector. And on the other hand, rather than the federal sector, you had the states that were active in this role. Second, the importance of civil societies in these countries. Civil society in some countries, like the United States and to a certain extent also Brazil, have played a great role of advocacy. Advocacy means they've proven crucial in trying to convince public authorities of the need to address with specific measures the cultural sector. And third, as far as the relationship between public authorities and the cultural sector is concerned, we have the issue of regional versus national. As I said, federal states, and here again, the United States, Brazil, and to a certain extent, even India, have been much less capable and effective in addressing the issues of the cultural sector than state or local authorities. Third main factor, and here I conclude, the beliefs and the ideas of the political leaders have been crucial in explaining answer that were given and the comprehensiveness of the answer given to the policy to the cultural sector. And again, here, Brazil and the United States, together with India, are on one side as compared to other countries. What I mean here is that in countries in which the government were either overlooking or minimizing the impact and consequences of COVID-19, the response to or addressing the cultural sector needs has been much slower and less efficient than in countries in which the governments were quicker in grasping the scope and the implications of the COVID-19. Second, countries in which neoliberal ideological positions are more influential in shaping the market of the cultural and creative sector has been less quick in reacting as public authorities than in countries which this neoliberal perspective coexist together with other, I don't want to say socialistic because that would be totally a misnomer, but let's say more public-oriented kind of approach. So these three factors, again, financial resources, relationship between the cultural sector and the public authorities, and the beliefs and ideologies of those who run those countries explain a lot about the difference between India, Brazil, the United States, very often on one end, and some European countries and others elsewhere in the world, especially in Asia on the other. I stop here and I already took 2 minutes more than I was supposed to do.
Thank you, Pierangelo. Thank you. No, you were really on time. Thanks, thanks for keeping the time. And thank you for giving us this, very quick and interesting overview. I saw the panelists nodding all the time, so I'm really very curious to hear from you. And I would start with Lauren. As I said, the study has been released in February, but finalized around the autumn 2020. So I would ask you, given the background you have just heard from Pierangelo, how things have progressed since then. And has there been any lasting change that you would sense or feel in the culture sector, or you feel that it's still under an emergency situation? Let's start with you, Lauren. Yeah, please.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sana. And I'm really glad to be with you all today. I think this is a really great question that is difficult to answer as we're still really in the midst of this. We can certainly reflect on the immediate impacts, but in terms of lasting impacts, it's hard to fully comprehend all of the lasting changes because in this moment, so many of us are still grieving our individual and collective losses. I would say globally, the sector is still in an emergency situation. While in the US, vaccine rates are much higher than in most countries, and we are in a process of reopening, though it varies greatly on a state-by-state basis. So while we're not still in an emergency situation, the sector is really just beginning to emerge from the dire state that it's been in the past year. I think the inequities in our societies that have long predated this pandemic have really been exposed through the impacts of COVID-19, and this certainly includes the cultural sector. We've seen many businesses that have shuttered during the pandemic, and these are disproportionately those that were already on the margins. Mainstream museums and cultural institutions had the funds to survive this crisis. I'm based in New York, and Broadway is set to reopen in September, but many organizations run by people of color are more likely to report that they currently lack the funds they need to return to in-person programming than those run by non-POC. And though we are slowly reopening in the US, there are lasting uncertainties around how COVID-19 will continue to affect our communities. As we've mentioned, as this report definitely makes clear, the precarities of the sector have really been laid bare by the pandemic. And it's become clear that independent artists and smaller arts organizations will need to build out flexible emergency or rainy day funds. And we've had to abandon some of the old ways of working for newer, more flexible means to meet the needs of the moment. And these include moving online, like we're doing in our conversation today. I do want to end with some optimism because I think there's a lot of opportunity for the sector in this moment. The mainstream art sector has been built on a history of extraction and structurally dependent on an art market and the value of individualism. This moment, though, gives us the opportunity to center the humanity of artists and cultural producers over and above a reduction of an object, experience, or product to its ascribed market value. And by supporting especially socially engaged cultural actors, we can really elevate the real political, social, civic, and healing value of art to societies during these desperate times. We don't have all the answers yet, but I think we're in a period of experimentation where independent artists and arts and culture organizations are finding new ways of working and creative solutions to the massive issues we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was really very, very interesting. And it raises many other subsequent questions that we might address at later at the session of questions and answers. Thanks a lot for sharing this thought. Thank you. I would move to Mohit now. Mohit, I'm turning to you to ask the same question. What is the situation also from your perspective in India? How do you see this has developed the recent months, I would say?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think the situation around the world and the partner countries and primarily in India also remains the same. We are actually under emergency, primarily the culture and the creative sector. Looking at various variables, looking at how a few of agencies which are primarily the Indian economy and the creative and cultural sector is informal. So primarily all the small organizations and private practitioners are freelancers. So that's how it's a very less opportunity to to interact with the federal government at that level. Primarily the kind of aid or the emergency fund was developed in the recent times was by the local government, which was very minimal, just at the benefit of being surviving. In the response, artists had tried to kind of go towards digitizations, which was again was a lot of challenges with the kind of tier 2 and tier 3 cities in India with less of internet and services digital skills availability, which again put forward the question, do we had those capacities on that one point of level in those areas, and to the other is actually artists really wanted to even kind of share their culture at the very global stage of because there were questions of authenticity coming up, and the kind of how cultural actors want to produce their stuff online was also a challenge. Primarily going on to more variables of artists of the rural India are they're not even equipped with all these kind of they were not ready for it. So I think there was I think no one perceived for the situation as elsewhere. So the issues remains the same with the digitization as well. Coming on to the more aspects of the at the federal level, which thankfully I was also the part of the project at the point of tangible heritage, where we tried, since the international mobility was cut down, and we were aware that there won't be any foreign investment coming in terms of tourism of cultural heritage. So ministry tried to kind of give it a different response. So there were projects like which were already running and which was still continued to develop infrastructure facilities and cultural heritage sites, primarily in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, with the hope that once the situation is normal and these cities which are actually not being visited by the international tourists, and so would be kind of open up to them as well. So as a new tourism market would be open up. So the kind of response in that way was quite vivid in terms of the process was continuous. The other response with the ministry was with the Ministry of Tourism try to also digitize at the more very rigorously on as we are aware of Incredible India platform, which has been projecting sites at the global level of all. So they have kind of picked up. But I think at one point of time, even the situation once worst in the second wave, all the funds were cut down at that point of time, because I think we were quite in a hurry. That's what I would say, to open up with the kind of all congregational gatherings at a large scale, which has one of the Kumbh is just one of the major cultural heritage of India, which is visited by both foreigner and the national at a very large scale. Though COVID guidelines and measures were taken, but I think it still backfired, and then it still didn't came up to which is then with the sensitivity of not adhering to the measures in all those areas, took it to a different level. I think the policy response is actually required, because majority, again, as we know, it's a very informal sector in our country. So I think it has to be, and primarily apart from the intangible cultural heritage, which still has a kind of proper policies, but at the kind of support for tangible heritage, or which is immovable properties, and the cultural practitioners primarily working in those areas are not that kind of of that stature that they could go up to the authoritarian level to discuss all those kind of funding and emergency funds. So I think the response have been trying to be resilient, but I think it's still in a very serious state of emergency. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mohit. Thank you for these insights, and thank you also for bringing this element of the link to cultural tourism and cultural heritage sites and all these countries. It's the situation in many countries where borders have been blocked, and the very first thing that has been felt is really the cultural heritage sites and sectors. And I guess we will also come back to that later. Thank you, Mohit. I move to Beck now. Yes.
Hi, Zana.
Is it the same situation? Brazil is still in an emergency situation, like I understand in India and also in the US?
Yes, and not only in the cultural sector. Well, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here talking to you. I'm sorry for eventual noises in the background. Yeah, because as you know, the world is under renovation, and so are my neighbors. So yeah, maybe it can interfere a little bit. But
no problem.
Well, yeah. Thanks for the invitation. I have to start saying that it's always tough to be a Brazilian nowadays in international debates on culture and cultural policy, because for many years I was proud to talk about my country in this regard, but things changed. But well, let me update a little bit what happened since the release of the report. I was happy to take part in a national research I conducted by the Observatory of Creative Economy of Bahia in Brazil, which was one of the first national research on the impact of COVID-19 in the creative economy. The same research that is mentioned in the report, so we were really happy for it. And this research was released in August 2020. And by then, the scenario was pretty bleak. We had by then, in August last year, 100,000 deaths. At the cultural venues were closed. And so the events, we had no vaccines yet. And we had already a few support schemes for the cultural sector conducted mainly by the local level, the cities and the states. Since then, as Professor Isenia Pierangelo said, due to an unprecedented successful advocacy campaign on national level in Brazil, we had the Aldir Blanc Act approved by the end of 2020, allowed to unfreeze around 3 billion Brazilian reais, which is something around $600 million from federal funds to support the sector. Aldir Blanc, by the way, was a great Brazilian musician and composer that died from COVID in the beginning of the pandemic. So now the funds were decentralized to the 26 Brazilian states and to almost all of our 5,000 cities. So it was indeed good news, a huge relief to the sector, but it's far from the solution. Now, we are almost in July. 1 year after this, the vaccination is progressing slowly. Most of the cultural venues are still closed. And now we are moving a new battle with the federal government to approve a new act, which is called a Paulo Gustavo Act, with the same aim to unfreeze federal funds that already belong to the cultural sector. And I'm hopeful that we're going to be successful again, because we learned a lot with this advocacy and campaign. And again, Paulo Gustavo was another artist, a very popular comedian in Brazil that died in May from COVID. So this illustrates, this reinforces the feeling that Brazil is still sort of trapped in 2020. We didn't move on yet. But one of the findings of our research, of your research, was that even though the sector is closed, we are not paralyzed. Things are still happening. The migration and the adaptation to digital were impressive. And I'm sure that the sector will survive, but the damages are still in progress. And even though here in Brazil, most of the established, the mainstream cultural institutions, they are public funded. So it means that they have lesser risks to cease to exist. We have reasons to be concerned with the freelancers, the independent venues, the festivals, and the folk, the traditional cultures, all these central parts of the cultural ecosystem in Brazil, and they are still in great danger. And wanted to finish, at the danger, it's not only in the cultural sector, but the whole country. As I said in the beginning, the whole country is still in a emergency situation, and not only because of the pandemic. As a Brazilian, I have the obligation to to remind you that we have now in Brazil a government that is an open enemy of culture, of arts, of education, of diversity, of science. And last week, we reached the terrible number of 500,000 deaths in Brazil. And this very day, 2,000 people may die from COVID in our country. And the cultural sector, has to take part in the solution. Yeah, we need much more than resilience, but this is the situation we are facing now.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you for sharing your insights, but also your feelings with such an openness. And I take the opportunity to say congratulations for the book, actually, you have just released. Actually, when we have designed this workshop, we have thought about resilience. There is a lot of discussions surrounding resilience and what does it mean, and in some contexts and in some let's say in some context it's accepted, in other contexts is even not accepted to talk about resilience. And that's why we questioned how much the culture sector, artists, operators, how much they can be resilient, how much we can ask them actually to be resilient again and again. We believed internally in our discussion that there are really limits to resilience. And it's interesting to see in all the three sharing you have just made that you all, I mean, you put light on some positive notes of hope, probably, but also there is some kind of readiness or some commitments to adjust, to adapt to using digitalization, using other things, and thinking again about advocacy and moving, etc. And this is really very, very, very much impressive, I would say, really, and very much appreciated. But that was the question we had in our, let's say, behind here in our brains, how much the sector in this situation can be resilient. Are there limits to resilience or not? But let me go to ask you another question, because now we have a kind of a more clear idea, I would say, about the situation in your respective countries. But we wanted also to take this, given your experience at local, national and international level, we wanted really to look at international cultural relations here and cross-borders collaboration. And I would start with Mohit, maybe asking you how you would describe the current cultural relations and cross-border collaborations. Is it existing? Is it, do you see it as a priority or a must in this current context? Or has it really shifted a lot during the pandemic? Because at the end, this is what we are also, and this is the study has shown all the implication of the crisis on international cultural relations, and some of them are not really clear for many of us, and we are always attempting to shed light on that, and we are very happy to hear from you and to see what do you think about this. I would start with you, Mohit.
Yeah, I think international relations in per se is very significant. It actually draws wall between the people. It drops down the wall between the people. So I think as a significant tool, it has been kind of prioritized in various sectors, but I think not that significantly in the field of culture till now. The way we have responded in terms of health sector with the partner countries and with the Europe and the rest of the world, I believe it would have been the similar response have been kind of resonated in the sector as well in the field of culture. And it was actually, the both ways the response which, we received and we gave in terms of health sector. So I think to move on, since in last year in 2020, there was a strategic partnership between India and EU for, a roadmap of 2025 for, kind of cultural relations for next 5 years to strengthening and, mutual cooperations. And education and knowledge sharing and culture is also one of the pillars of that. So we are just hoping, with this kind of strategic partnership, we'll be moving forward more kind of vigorously and taking into consideration the kind of, the cultural cooperation which is needed across the world. Secondly, what I presume is that, the kind of, we have to actually open up a bit more in terms of art and cultural sector. So as your research also says, the kind of regional dynamics we have in India, so we have to open up more globally towards that. So I think that is required as a very significant kind of step, from shifting from local to the global. The other thing which I can see from, the model of cooperation and international culture relationship is the kind of digitalization, the kind of skill set and the innovation needs to be shared, not only in terms of, specifically in terms of knowledge sharing, but also in terms of challenges which have been facing from previous years. Every country across the world have been facing these issues. So I think the knowledge sharing would also be, kind of a way forward. I would say advocacy as kind of a cultural relation is also a very significant tool to move forward, which is kind of very, is not that kind of strong in a country like ours. And as I have already mentioned, with primarily the informal economy, which takes part in this as well. So I think the other, the most important, what I think cultural relations, which would help in, taking this into consideration, would be the factor of convergence. How, culture and heritage, all the and the practitioners could be at the centerpiece of the recovery. So obviously, this is the sector which needs to be, it needs support from every end. So we still have, kind of projects which are, worth $1 million, which are still coming up in our country. But I think the idea is how many people they are benefiting. So I think cultural practitioners and the people as per se should be at the centerpiece of, all the recovery of the post-COVID recovery. So that's how, my views towards the significance of the learnings in terms of capacity building, the innovation, the the kind of people-to-people collaborations. And I would say, I think non-government sector and local authorities in the state level and the municipalities have reacted, a way better. So that's what I think. If these actors are, exposed to the opportunities of international cultural relations, they might, get some, few thought processes and innovations to put forward at least their, individual states forward. So I think it's a very significant tool to put people at the center and then planning the recovery of culture sector in India. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mohit. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. I would move to Lauren. Yeah, I would ask the same question. Love to hear from you.
Thank you, Sana. And Mohit, I have to say, I fully agree that I don't think at a government level, the sector really takes advantage of international relations. And I would say, I wish it was a larger priority at a governmental level in the US, for sure. I have a bit more hope under our new administration that we might make some headway as opposed to our previous. However, I think very much so in the non-governmental organization, in the private sector, I've seen the importance of international collaboration. In my role at the Open Society Foundations, I'm focused on international collaboration. And I've come to recognize, especially in this moment, the importance of solidarity and building communities beyond borders, understanding we are not alone in this work. We have all been dealing with this disease that has transcended borders. And I think as we've had to move our work online during the pandemic, physical boundaries have become less relevant. And I think back to an event that I helped to organize back in 2017 that brought together over 80 artists, activists, and funders from around the world around the ideas of art, public space, and closing societies. And during this convening, it is where I learned the lessons of the importance of solidarity and connecting beyond our borders. Many of the artists in attendance were already working in relative isolation and some in exile. And the experience of being able to exchange, to understand that they weren't alone in their experiences, but also to be able to support each other in thinking through solutions to the problems they were facing was so important. And I think it was echoed again in my experience with the Global Cultural Leadership Program when we were together in 2018, the election happened in Brazil, and we were able to come together as a group to write a solidarity statement and put this out as cultural leaders throughout the world, that we were standing with artists and cultural producers of Brazil and against the Bolsonaro regime. I think really the importance of international cultural relations in this moment is it can help us protect from future harm to the sector, sharing resources across borders, sharing best practice, and this idea that I've said, building solidarity so that individuals do not feel alone in these difficult times. If we can continue to build a better cultural relations infrastructure during non-crisis times, we can have more coordination in these efforts in the future. You know, in the US, we had many joint philanthropic efforts to provide grants to artists and cultural producers in need during the pandemic, such as the Artist Relief Fund, or even the newly announced Mellon's 125 million Creatives Rebuild New York initiative. And I know there have been many similar initiatives around the world, including a great example of collaboration between the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture and Cultural Resource, who initially collaborated in early 2020 to set up the Lebanon Solidarity Fund to address the country's political and economic crisis, as well as closing down of venues and activities due to COVID-19. The funds were meant to address the needs of cultural organizations. And with this existing infrastructure from their initial collaboration, they were able to have a vehicle ready to rapidly move support on the ground and to mobilize resources from diverse international sources, including philanthropy and the private sector, to address emergency needs after the Beirut explosion in August 2020. So the more we have these collaborations and infrastructures in place, the more we can respond rapidly in moments and times of need. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for mentioning this initiative between AFAC and Cultural Resources. Actually, you are totally right. It was quite rapid and quite quick, and it had a lot of impact in the sector. And I understand collaboration is still going on for the coming months. Thanks a lot. Beth, I turn to you for asking you the same question, your views on international cultural relations in this context.
Yes. Well, I think I completely agree with Mohit and Lauren. I agree that Lauren, that solidarity is key. It's the only way to a common future. And I think one of the consequences and long-term effects of the pandemic for the cultural sector is that it has completely forced us to rethink and reframe the meaning behind some concepts, like for instance audiences. Like now we need to think about audiences beyond visitors and beyond attendees. It's something else now it's something bigger now. And the same happens with the concept of international or cross-border cooperation and collaboration. The fact that we may not be able for a while to tour, to visit countries, to travel, to get to know personally cities, venues, and to see our colleagues, it doesn't mean that we cannot collaborate and create together, that we cannot do this. And I think it's quite the opposite, because we are now in the sort of the same crossroads and facing similar challenges. And in this scenario, we need to find answers and to imagine solutions together. So I think that even with the physical restriction, even with this emergency situation in countries like Brazil that make international cooperation not to be a priority, of course, we are not even able to travel now. But I think that even with this current restrictions, we may still face it for some time. And just a note, imagine that I used to work with a youth orchestra that toured with 130 young musicians in many countries. We have no idea when this is going to be possible again. But even in this scenario, and specifically because of this scenario, we need international cooperation more than ever. But I think that we need to reinvent what it means now. And maybe to focus international collaboration in some parts of it, like knowledge transfer, capacity building, in digital co-creation, and many things that are possible and much needed. And the pandemic, it has pushed the cultural sector into the digital transformation, and there is no return to that, and maybe we can benefit with this to rethink, to reinvent a cross-border cooperation.
Thank you, Beth, for sharing those elements and hinting also to the future. Maybe we have some time. We have 6 minutes before we start the questions and answer session. I would ask the participants to start putting their questions. If they have questions, post them on the chat so that we can take them as soon as we start this session, or raise their hands also. That's also a possibility to ask the question. Before that, I would turn to Pierangelo to have your first reactions, in plural maybe, on what you've heard from Mohit, Beth, and Lauren.
Yes, sure. And let me say that in addressing what has been said, I'll try to play the devil's advocate on a very specific personal perspective, the one of a European, because both Lauren, Beth, and Mohit have all stressed with different words that we are in a very special situation that we could call, using an economic term, a supply-demand gap. We have an increasing demand, if not need, for more, better, more effective international cultural relations. But on the other hand, we should ask ourselves whether the pandemic made the world less congenial to international cultural relations. International cultural relations do not occur in a vacuum, but need a set of structural conditions to perform at their best. So the question we should ask ourselves is whether these conditions might be there in the future. We should also be aware that, as again, most of you, Mohit, Bert said, all of you have said, the future is still behind the horizon line. I mean, for Brazil and probably for India, maybe more than from the United States. And even if here in Italy, it looks like maybe it's the summer, is the forthcoming summer that things might change, still, and half of our population has been vaccinated with at least one jab, still we are in a situation that is not very different from the one we had in the past. Now, let me articulate why I am a bit pessimistic about this meeting the demand with the supply from a European perspective. Why? Because I think that the European Union had to play and was supposed to play a great role in fostering at least some of the structural conditions that make international cultural relations easier. But there are a set of elements that make me think that this might be difficult in the future. First, COVID-19 has impacted the operational capacity and the political willingness of many European countries to invest both money and resources in international cultural relations. I mean, this is not simply because we are selfish or egoistic, but simply resources have been diverted from some purposes to others. So there is less money left for some things because more money has been put on other things because of the agenda that is dominating the European Union, and understandably so, somebody would say. So our ability to foster the conditions for promoting international cultural relations are weakening. But also the indirect impact of the COVID-19 on our cultural sector might affect this. Why? Because there is an increasing tension within the European Union and between the European Union and other countries in, on the one hand, the need for addressing the emergency situation, and on the other, the conditions that make international cultural relations healthy. I'll give you a couple of examples. We are living in a world in which superpower rivalry, is increasing. Don't forget that the vaccine diplomacy, as has been called, has inserted an element of competition in relations that were already strained. The Brazilian, at least for a period of time, the American, and to a certain extent, the Indian governments are a good example of populistic and, using another word, illiberal governments that try to shape an agenda that is not conducive to international cultural relations. So for all those reasons, I am, and the European Union seems to, as I said, to be taken into this whirlpool. The last strategic review of the European Union, I don't remember the exact name that we give to this document, suggests that we should move toward the European Union as a new superpower. That, I mean, might be a good idea in itself for some, but clearly is not the one that is better to promote international cultural relations, as the joint communication was suggesting. So for all these reasons, I think that the future might be behind the horizon line, but I'm not sure that what is behind the horizon line is something we would like to see once we get there. So I'll stop with this gloomy, but I might give some more positive view later on, depending on the comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierangelo. Yeah, that was not really very gloomy, but still it was interesting. But as I think all the three of you have said that, let's put it clearly, the sector is not counting that much on the actions of the governments, and that solidarity has to be built, and that there are that borders, as Lauren said, should not be an issue, and that the culture sector should be able in a way or another to build community and solidarity across borders. I'd like to keep that as really a big note of hope, and let's see also how things evolved. So we have many questions, and we'll try to address as many as possible. So just bear with me. So we have. Okay, so maybe I start with Steve. Maybe I start with Steve Conant. So Steve is an Indian international relations student from Brussels, interested in cultural diplomacy, cultural relation. The question is for Mohit and anyone else actually who would like to answer. What do you think is the scope of more support from developed nations or supranational bodies such as the EU, the UK, or the US to provide funding as well as a platform for independent and up-and-coming artists and groups from rural areas in India who have been severely affected by the pandemic and cannot rely on the digitalization of culture and arts in India, and is also not getting sufficient financial support from the local government. Steve is giving also some examples here, and I would stop here because you have already a question there. So who would like to take the question? We touched a bit upon the role of governments and public authorities. That was the first part of the question. Mohit, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
I think answering to the first part of the question is, so, you know, at times the setup within our country is very different from the developed world. So, you know, we really need to, I completely appreciate with the thought, you know, how independently we can do it. But, you know, the idea is we can only strengthen at the local level. But if we need to upscale, it has to be upscaled from the federal government level as well. So, you know, I think the idea of, you know, every cultural actor playing its own role or as a stakeholder is very significant. So you can start strengthening, you know, in terms of digitization, in terms of innovation, capacity building, you know, kind of knowledge sharing at the local level with the artists, you know, engaging with the artists. So there are, you know, kind of multiple agencies involved within the states and municipalities who takes care of that. But I think the real idea of upscaling, you know, even not even at the global level, even at the national level, I would say, the idea is it has to be really supported by the federal government. With this, because the idea is it has to be a pan-India across program, and when if it has to come, you know, till the reach of international cooperation, it should be, you know, being supported at the federal level. So you can strengthen, you can be resilient at the local level, but, you know, being to upscale and to have a greater outreach will have to be, you know, from the federal level. It has to be in the form of policy support, you know, which will enable, you know, many, you know, artisans and group like what Steve has been saying, to, you know, to engage with, you know, the communities. You know, I mean, I'll say we are just fortunate enough, like one of us, you know, to get engaged with GCRP, and, you know, I think it's the idea of how, you know, how you open up. You know, even you have to even open up from your end. So it's not only about the federal government, but the, you know, from the organizations and the municipalities, how open up they are towards, you know, towards their outreach. So I think digitalization though have some challenges, but, you know, that is in the situation has the only means to, you know, to have a global outreach. That's what, you know, I would like to say.
Thank you, Mohit. Thank you for a very clear answer. Then to take the second question that is for the three of you, actually, from Carla. Hi, Carla. Carla is asking, what was the change that you have observed occurring in the culture and creative sectors, which you think will become a positive, permanent feature post-COVID? Lauren is nodding, but not sure. You want to start? Yeah,
sure, I can start. I mean, I think that digitization is certainly a change that will continue. I'm not sure. I'm not sure fully that I think it's positive. I think it's positive in that we can connect beyond our borders, but I do think that there is something special about the arts in person. And so I think there's a balance in the way we move forward after pandemic, when we can be in person again. You know, I pose this question, what's the future of the arts without gathering? And I hope that there is a future of the arts with gathering, but I will say the online space has opened us up to a lot more connection, but also I've been seeing more archival projects. And so we're, it's not just about creating new works online, but how are we cataloging things? How are we making work that is in public space available now online? And I will also say one of my concerns about moving work online is that it's a place of peril as well. You know, there is opportunity for spaces of connection, healing, allowing people to bond when they cannot be face to face, but at the same time, participants in these spaces are made vulnerable to harassment. I know there was a lot reported in the beginning of the pandemic about people Zoom bombing or coming into Zooms and hurling racist and offensive language at people in panels like this or during thesis defenses. And as well, we're vulnerable to authoritarian abuse in online spaces. And so I think one thing we need to be cautious of and continue to work and exchange around is our own digital security and best practices that we can share to create these spaces, to create more safe spaces online.
I would like to add to it, because I agree with Lauren that the digital transformation is a way of no return. And of course, we are going we have to find some balance, because of course, it's not going to substitute the life experience, but it can be an important part of access and experience creation, especially in countries in which you have access problems to culture and cultural venues. And so I think this is going to be a positive effect. And I always say that, of course, there will be some positive effects out of this crisis, but not because of the pandemic, but despite of it. And digital transformation is one of it. But I would also like to add, just like we have seen in Brazil, it seems that this huge crisis, this unprecedented crisis, also opened up the chance for the sector to organize itself. Yeah, and sometimes for the first time in a national level, and to see the commonalities, and they are greater than the differences inside at the sector. And so I think that this, for instance, in Brazil, this advocacy technology that we are beginning to develop, I hope this stays in the sector. And if it stays, of course, that this is going to be really positive for the future challenges we're going to face.
Thank you, Bex. Thank you. Mohit, any positive thing you will see that will last in the future in India?
Yeah, so I think my very brief thoughts on the same is, whatever we say, challenges of digitization, but in person, or in general also, like in conservation, when when we revive kind of tangible heritage, we say what is being done is authentic, and then what we do, anything after that, is obviously a new thing. Whatever maybe we revive in similar design, or similar kind of a space, or similar kind of a spirit, but the new becomes new. So that's what I think, but we can't stop doing it. So there are challenges for digitization, I understand, but I think that's is the way forward. Not only I mean, like, what I think is, if the kids of from 5 years of age can adapt themselves to be so resilient that they're doing their kind of complete education from their home as well. So why can't we accept all those challenges and move forward? So I think the idea is, uh, uh, I mean, there would be challenges, but you can't, there is no stopping. And I think it's actually getting ready for us to, face the problems, and then, overcome how to the mitigation measures, how to do that. That's what I think, my views on the same.
A huge resilient state of mind, actually. That's it. I want to move with a question from Avril Joffre. Hi, Avril. People are talking about vaccine access in the context of deliberate global architecture of unfairness, which will impact on international cultural cooperation. What are your views on this, since the cultural and creative sector has been so deeply affected? What might this mean for ICR? And this is a question for the four of you. So who would like to start? Any thought about it? Pierangelo, maybe?
Yes, I'll try to answer both these and Carla's question. I say hi to Carla. I play the pessimistic role. Now let me play the optimistic role. Moving for, and I'm talking here about what has been the different or the changes due to the pandemic. I'm now speaking as an Italian, but this applies also to other European countries I've seen from surveys. Shifting from the producers of culture to the consumers of culture. One maybe lasting effect of the pandemic might be that the consumption of cultural products of any kind will increase because we have more time. And since we have more time, at least some surveys seems to show, both in Italy and in UK, from what I've seen, that the consumption of cultural products, movies, books, music, has been increasing over the pandemic. Now, since we are shifting from a fire to ice means information and cultural economy, in which less people will work for less time, maybe this would be good for the cultural sector because there will be more demand for it. I don't know. This is a reflection that might deserve more attention that I'm giving now. Moving now to the deliberate global architecture on fairness. I mean, this is what I was suggesting, that vaccine might play a role in this, and of course affect also international cultural relations, because we should not forget that vaccine diplomacy is a way of playing a sort of cultural diplomacy as well. So showing sympathy, solidarity, help toward another country with purposes that are not only altruistic, but also driven by national consideration. So yes, in a world that is characterized by structural unfairness, like the one in which we live, clearly vaccine diplomacy might magnify these inequalities, might make them more resistant to change, and so might affect also international cultural relations. How to address this is another issue on which we might need more time than I have now, I think, looking from Sana gasping to me that I should cut short.
No, not at all. Not at all. Anyone else would like to add to answer that question or take part of it? In case.
I'm happy to come in. I agree with what Pierangelo has said. I think I just wanted to raise something. There's a campaign, Free the Vaccine, which is a collaboration between the universities allied for essential medicines and the Center for Artistic Activism, which is a global campaign bringing together artists, activists, university students to advocate for COVID-19 diagnostic tools, treatments, and vaccines to be available to everyone, everywhere, free at the point of delivery. And this is, I think, a great example of kind of the opportunity of this moment, that it's fully done online, and there are groups working together on different thematic issues, including making sure that there is vaccine access. And they were actually able to get the US government to sign the TRIPS waiver. So I think there is hope in this.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Maybe I take a more specific question from the chat. And it's a question from Chris. Hi, Chris. Chris is asking about touring and mobility, asking you if you have considered other innovative and environmentally sustainable ways of meeting one another, others than meeting virtually, of course, and digitally. If anyone has any idea about that. Of course, it makes it very tricky if borders are closed or constraints are very high, but I'm turning to you to see whether you have thought of any way to meet. Lauren was saying nothing will impede artists and cultural operators to meet, even if borders are closed somehow, let's say. Is there any? That's a difficult one, actually. Yeah? That's a difficult one. But you may, yeah.
Oh, Sana, I was going to say that's a very difficult question. I think anecdotally, one thing I've seen that has been wonderful during the pandemic is hyper-local as opposed to touring. Seeing artists and musicians in the US do porch concerts, socially distant porch concerts for neighbors at a very hyper local level, because that's what we can do in this moment.
Yeah.
But I wish I had more large scale ideas.
Yeah. I would like to add that well, maybe this time of restriction is a way, it's a chance for us to develop new collaboration technologies, because even after the pandemic, we have to face that international collaborations may keep changing for another reasons. We cannot forget sustainability issues. We cannot forget the climate change impact, and that may turn these huge international projects not so viable, and maybe the international collaborations in person they become less frequent, but it doesn't mean that we cannot make meaningful collaboration between these chances to travel and using this online environment that we have now.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Beth. Solidarity is coming again also in the chat, and Fanny is asking, Fanny Bouquerel, what according to you are the conditions for solidarity among cultural professionals and artists to develop and to last? What are the conditions of solidarity? Mm-hmm. I'm changing my screen.
Empathy in first place, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it is. It's willing to perform the solidarity actions. It's the openness to to do things like this, I'm really happy to have the opportunity and to know how things are in US, in India, and to learn and to listen to my colleagues. And I think this active listening, this openness to other realities, I think it is the first step. It is key.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Maybe we can take another question from Maud Kamar. Do you think the COVID crisis can be an opportunity for adopting culture and development aspects of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations? Yeah, it's more about bringing in development, stronger, I would say, development aspects in international cultural relations. Who would like to take this one? Pierangelo, maybe?
Well, let me start with the clarification. Cultural relations and cultural diplomacy are, academically speaking, I consider two different things, very different. Never confuse them.
Exactly, and this is the question is like putting them a bit in the same basket and see how aspects of development can strengthen them.
So
let's talk about cultural relations and not about cultural diplomacy. Let's take it as it was asked for cultural relations.
Okay, yes, it could, it can, if in fact. And first, to follow on what Beth just said, I think that one important role that solidarity can play, and this webinar could be an example, is that we are not alone in our own experiences. I mean, the COVID-19 has been, to a certain extent, an experience in isolation. We felt we were alone against a sea of troubles, to paraphrase a famous artist. But this is not the case. Our report shows clearly that in different areas of the world, from Africa to Europe, from Latin America to Asia, we were coping with in different fashion, with some of the same challenges. So from this viewpoint, these virtual exchanges help us to breed a sense that we are together in this spaceship Earth, so to say, to address this kind of issue. And this is important also, I think, for a second reason. I think this is the first case in history in which, for the combination of the high interdependence and the pervasive nature of the pandemic, we felt all together. I mean, what we were experiencing in Italy, what was an Indian, an African, an American was experiencing. And to a certain extent, this might change our way of viewing things. And I'm surprised that so far no politician has exploited this for political purposes. That could be good, because after all, after a bunch of populists, we might want to have a bunch of globalists popularizing different ideas. And I have to say, here I conclude, that the attempt by the Biden administration to free, to a certain extent, the vaccine policy might be a first step in the right direction. And I'm very sorry that the Europeans didn't take with the necessary enthusiasm this first opening. And I stop here.
Thank you, Pierangelo. Maybe we have still time for one question. You can have a look at the chat. There are some reactions to your answers of some of the questions. There is some very interesting elements also mentioned also by Carla on freedom of expression. And she's asking the question, how we can encourage international cultural relations beyond usual suspects and those we already know. Are we just going to continue with those we already know and agree with? This can also apply to national spheres. So how do we reach out to, giving the current situation and giving what you have explained and exposed, the three of you, how do you see this as, how do you see those who are involved in international cultural relations reaching more to other actors, and listening maybe to critics, to contradictory voices, to populist voices, to really other voices than those who agree on the main, I would say, guidelines of international cultural relations. How can we do that?
I would say that's a huge question that we may not have time to get into in our last 5 minutes, but I would say if it's something that people are interested in, I know you mentioned you were going to briefly talk about the new Global Cultural Relations program, but I would highly recommend, because being in spaces where you're connecting with so many different people across the world who are working in the cultural space, you think of ideas, and I have collaborated with so many folks from the program that I would not have met if it weren't for that space.
Thank you, Lauren. You are giving me really an opportunity to say a word about the Global Cultural Relations program before closing. Actually, we have just 3 minutes left. As I said, in what we call in the other platform in the past, we had this Global Cultural Leadership program that has been run for 3 years. And we are now preparing and developing a new program that will be called Global Cultural Relations Program. And we are currently working on it and shaping its format and content. And as you have mentioned also during this discussion, how much is difficult that we are not meeting and that we will not be meeting very soon cultural practitioners from all over the world. The program has a global coverage, so it will be really open to all cultural operators from all the countries, but it will have to be, at least for this, for its first edition, it will have to be online. So maybe there also, it has its pros, its cons, but maybe we can reach out to some cultural operators or artists or those who are very active in this sector, new ones that are not what Carla has mentioned, the usual suspects. So the program is under development. It's not at all ready, not for the moment, but we will be probably sending out a call for application at the end of July or early August. We are currently working on it, and I would really invite all those who are interested to spread the word once it's public. So let me close here because we run out of time. I wanted mainly to thank you all very much for sharing your experience, for your openness, for your honesty, and for all your insights. As I said in the beginning, we really wanted to check out where we are and where we are going, where we are heading. I feel that there is a lot to do, and reinvention, as Beth has said, the reinvention, rethinking of all what we have takes time. It can be, of course, done, but it takes time, and I have the impression that there is still to learn and to know and to exchange, and I hope that we can do that, at least in the framework of the platform and many other frameworks that are interested into this topic. So I wanted to thank you again. Thanks a lot for your time, for your input, And thanks to all the participants who stayed till the end and shared interesting remarks and questions. So we keep in touch for in all terms for the future. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye to all.
Thank you.